The Messerschmitt Me-262. It ushered in a new era. It revolutionized aviation. Had it arrived just a year earlier, it could perhaps have altered the outcome of the Second World War, and therefore the very fabric of modern Europe. When it first entered combat in 1944, the Me-262 jet fighter was the world's most advanced combat aircraft. In the hands of an experienced German combat pilot, Messerschmitt's 262 jet fighter was invincible. In the Allied pilots who first faced it, the plane inspired awe and terror. Jet propulsion was only one of the revolutionary aspects of this amazing machine. The 262 also heralded the arrival of swept-wing technology. With a top speed of 540 miles per hour, it could outpace anything in the sky. This finely restored 262 at RAF Cosford's Aerospace Museum was one of the many captured as the Allies swept across Europe. Some of the lessons learned from it paved the way to a new age, the age of the jet. The seeds of jet propulsion go back to the beginning of the century. Henri Coandard's turbo-propulsor of 1910 was one of the earliest attempts to utilize turbine-generated thrust. It used a primitive ducted fan principle. On its maiden flight, the strange little aircraft burst into flames and crashed. Following the First World War, turbo superchargers like the Moss unit on this Packard biplane enhanced piston engine performance. It enabled flyers to carve new world altitude marks faster than the record books could log them. The first true jet engine was developed in Britain. Frustrated by years of government indifference, Frank Whittle, a former RAF pilot, successfully started the prototype to the W1X jet engine on April the 12th, 1937, and secretly ushered in a new age. At the same time in Germany, flight tests with this hybrid rocket-powered Heinkel HE-112 were receiving strong government backing. The Nazi regime was eager to see new propulsion systems put to use. 4 HE-112s were modified to test the prototype rocket motor, but only one was successfully flown. Throughout the 1930s, German aircraft designers skirted around the restrictions imposed on them by the Treaty of Versailles. A thinly disguised fighter like the Heinkel HE-70 Blitz posed as a high-speed mail plane. As Hitler gained control, advances in aviation were secretly promoted. Emphasis was placed on speed. New propulsion systems were eagerly fostered. The loophole in the treaty was that in 1919, jets and rockets seemed only distant dreams. Unknown to Germany's neighbors, engine designer Hans von Ohain, under Ernst Heinkel's patronage, had already developed an advanced jet engine. On August the 27th, 1939, his device lifted the tiny Heinkel HE-178 skyward. This was the first jet-powered flight in history. 5 days later, the world was plunged into a war that would span 6 years. Hitler entered the conflict with hopes of quick victories, using air power to strike hard and fast. In the heady days at the beginning of World War II, German forces swept through Europe. As victory followed victory, the need for a more formidable aircraft power plant was of little interest. In the eyes of the Führer, nothing could stop the daunting might of the Luftwaffe. The troops of the Reich now marched into Paris. Europe had crumbled before the Nazi juggernaut. There was no need for better or faster aircraft. The seemingly invincible Luftwaffe remained unchallenged. But the winds of victory began to change. In what became immortalized as the Battle of Britain, German and British pilots engaged in a deadly struggle high above England. By late 1941, fortunes had changed. The pride of Germany lay in pieces across Fortress Britain. In Germany, cries went out for the new, the stronger, the faster. Thoughts turned to the possibilities of the jet. The world's first successful twin-jet aircraft, designed specifically as a fighter, was Heinkel's HE-280. Ernst Heinkel's passion for high-performance aircraft had created a long line of firsts in this exciting new field. The HE-280 was first flown as a towed glider during 1940. These unpowered flights were made to trial flying characteristics because of the late delivery of the jet engines, thus making virtue of necessity. Throughout World War II, the Luftwaffe placed great emphasis on ease of maintenance, and in that the Heinkel HE-280 wasn't a problem. Early German jet engines, strained to the limit, weren't expected to have a very long lifespan. And because of this, they were designed and made with the utmost simplicity. The end result was an engine that could be quickly replaced. Engine mount hardpoints and hardware interfaces were limited in number and within easy reach. A panel on the upper surface provided ground crews easy access to the engine, which compared with its piston-powered counterparts was surprisingly light. The Heinkel displayed superior workmanship, highly refined aerodynamics, and rugged construction. When the 280's engines functioned properly, the aircraft was a pleasure to fly. Like most early jets, it was somewhat underpowered and had a notoriously short range. It first flew by jet power on April 2, 1941. Heinkel's 280 was at that time the most sophisticated and advanced jet plane in the world. Paralleling German efforts, Britain's Frank Whittle worked frantically on the first of two prototype Gloster E-2839s. This was a research aircraft and was to put Allied jet propulsion theories to the test. Simply constructed, the airframe was built to accommodate Whittle's jet engine. By May 1941, the Gloster took to the air in the first flight of an Allied jet. But the Heinkel 280 was years ahead of the British jet and proved itself lethal. In a trial fly-off, it completely outflew the Luftwaffe's best prop fighter. Even with advanced features including an ejector seat, problems with performance and range, compounded by Heinkel's political disfavor, killed any chances of the 280 becoming the world's first operational jet fighter. That honor was to go to another. The Messerschmitt Me-262 lacked much of the sophistication of the Heinkel jet. But it had a formidable image with its sleek, swept-back wings and two Junkers Jumo 004 jet engines slung below. The shark-like fuselage gave it a look of lethal elegance. The first four prototypes were built as tail draggers, the long nose pointing skywards. It was the kind of aircraft that even looked fast when it was standing still. And Messerschmitt had built the airframe to be rugged and dependable in action. Like the 280, the Messerschmitt fighter was designed for ease of maintenance, mandatory for a plane destined to operate from primitive airfields under combat conditions. The Junkers engines could be worked on or replaced without any extravagant equipment. Fuel and electrical systems were easily reached by panels located in the fuselage. The 262 was a perfect fusion of sophisticated state-of-the-art technology and simple design. The engines weren't ready for the first flight trials, so a 700 horsepower nose-mounted piston engine was used instead. Finally, in July 1942, the third Me-262, powered by two long-awaited Jumo jet engines, was ready to fly. The first successful flight of a jet-powered Me-262 was on July the 18th, 1942. The engines were deemed flight-worthy, and with Flugkapitän Fritz Wendel at the controls, it became the first of its kind to take to the air. During taxi runs, it was found the tail wouldn't elevate, so the test pilot tried a novel technique. As Wendel later recalled, "Immediately I touched the brakes, the tail lifted, and the elevators began to bite. My turbojets ran like clockwork, and it was a sheer pleasure to fly this new machine." The flight was not without incident, however. On touchdown, fuel that had accumulated in the bottom of the left engine nacelle burst into flames. But the damage was slight, and the aircraft flew again that same day. In the United States, the race for jet power had not gone unnoticed. Bell Aircraft's Model 27, later known as the P-59 Aerocomet, was powered by two GE turbojets, based on the original Whittle engine from Britain. Within a year of initial design work, the plane was ready for testing. It was transported by rail to Muroc Army Airfield in the California desert, and on October the 1st, 1942, with Bell test pilot Bob Stanley in the cockpit, the XP-59 took to the sky in the first flight of an American jet aircraft. Unfortunately, performance was not markedly improved over piston-engined aircraft of the day. But in spite of this, limited production of the Aerocomet began, and Bell went on to build over 60 of the planes. The jet had come to America. Back in Germany, the 262 was modified. Emulating its Heinkel jet competitor, Messerschmitt designers adapted the aircraft to nose wheel configuration. The tail dragger had bad visibility during takeoff and landing. The wings blocked airflow to the tail. The jet's thrust angle made takeoff even harder. The nose wheel would iron out these problems, but it also proved to be the plane's Achilles heel. Poor tire design and a weak strut assembly led to numerous accidents. In fact, the strut was so weak that even the slightest sideward impact could lead to catastrophic failure. The landing gear was raised and lowered hydraulically. Although in early 262s the main gear was deployed by gravity, the pilot would use a sideways yaw movement and the airflow to lock it down. In most regards, the Swallow, as it came to be known, was a marvel of German engineering. Easily built by relatively unskilled laborers, it was a simple yet ingenious aircraft. The fuselage consisted of separate components, quickly and easily assembled. As a unit, it could be removed from the wing and repaired and replaced in the field without difficulty. The nose package, containing the landing gear and the aircraft's weapons, could also be removed as a self-contained unit. Its four 30mm cannon had pneumatic cocking and were fired electronically. The two upper cannon carried 100 rounds each, and the two lower ones 80 rounds. At the tip of the nose, the 262 housed a combat camera to record the fate of its victims. The Messerschmitt Me-262 first tasted action in April 1944 while it was still part of a test squadron. 5 months later, this was replaced by the world's first all-jet operational fighter group, Kommando Novotny. Named after the air race Major Walter Novotny, the group went into action on October 3, 1944. 5 days later, its first jet was lost, when an unsuspecting pilot was jumped by an American P-51 Mustang. After landing, a wire mesh guard is placed over the intake to prevent anything from being sucked in. Prop pilots found the jet's traditional stick, with the gun trigger at the top, comfortably reassuring. Ground crews always double-checked the gun safety switch. The Me-262 carried a lethal combination of firepower. Safety was crucial in the field, with stockpiles of high explosives and volatile aviation fuels sharing the same environment. The airfield was a dangerous place to work. Here, the pilot waves the fuel truck out of the line of fire of the 262's array of cannon. Not a good place to park. In action, the jet was easy to support and didn't require the highly refined fuels of the piston engines. Instead, it simply tanked up with J2, a specially brewed version of diesel oil, and the aircraft's 4 fuel tanks took 655 gallons of the precious liquid. The aircraft was certainly well designed for a fast turnaround on the front. At the closing stages of war, some U.S. pilots had the task of flying captured 262s out of Germany. Bob Strobel found the ease of maintenance impressive.
One of the things that you want to be able to do in combat is to keep the maximum number of aircraft in operation. And to do that, you oftentimes have to change engines on them. Well, changing an engine on a Thunderbolt is at least a full day's job, if not 2 or 3, even under the best conditions. And yet I know for a fact you can change a jet engine on a Messerschmitt Me-262 in 30 minutes.
Each jet engine had a small 10-horsepower internal starter motor that ran on 2-stroke fuel. This small apparatus made the aircraft independent of cumbersome auxiliary starter units. The starter motor was located in the intake bullet at the front of the jet engine. Each of the starter motors could be electronically triggered from the cockpit, or if that failed, manually started with a D-ring and pull cable mounted in the bullet tip, rather like starting a lawnmower. But before the engine was turned over, the ground crew performed its daily ritual, inspecting the intake for debris and checking the compressor section, turbine, and stator blades. Next came the exhaust nozzle assembly and exhaust bullet. Ahead of the exhaust bullet was the exhaust turbine. This was checked very closely too. Damage of any kind to these delicate parts demanded immediate repair. The exhaust bullet, sometimes referred to as the onion, was unique to the Swallow's engine. Designed to move fore and aft, thereby increasing the exhaust area and enhancing thrust, its maximum travel was just over 7 inches. Other aspects of the Me-262 were just as innovative. The vertical tail and rudder were unusual because they came equipped with a trim tab, manually controlled from the cockpit. A small mechanical indicator let the pilot know just what position the trim tab was in. The pilot adjusted the horizontal tail by hand as well, vital in controlling an aircraft traveling at such high speeds. In an attempt to tame the Me-262's high landing and takeoff speeds, the aircraft was equipped with free-floating leading-edge slats. These greatly improved the wing's poor lift characteristics at slow speeds. In a glide, they extended at anything below 187 miles an hour. In a climb, at anything under 280 miles an hour. Retraction, on the other hand, resulted from aerodynamic forces at high speeds. The slats, which were mounted on ball bearings, had a tendency to stick. Ground checks for this were imperative, because if they didn't work in perfect unison, the pilot would lose control entirely, especially during landing and takeoff. Pre-flighting the aircraft was painstakingly carried out by the ground crew. All controls were manually and visually examined. As this went on, other Luftwaffe ground personnel replenished the pneumatic system's air tank and checked the landing gear's tire pressure. Hydraulic fluid, critical to safe flight, was topped up before every mission. This precious liquid controlled the flaps, landing gear, and brakes. The process was precise and thorough. Overlooking the slightest detail could prove fatal to the men in the air. Caution was a rule. These aircraft were built in difficult wartime conditions.
The rivets were rough on it, the skin was rough on it. It had sometimes even had wrinkles in it. It must have been very difficult for them to obtain the metals and the materials they needed to produce that airplane. The engine was not very well made and was really subject to failure, and it was due primarily to the raw materials and the conditions under which they had to be assembled and put together.
Messerschmitt had also designed the jet well for the pilot.
Your forward view was excellent, and with a tricycle landing gear, it gave you even better view for takeoff and landings. That was good. Cockpit arrangement was good. The layout on it was good. I think just generally the whole thing was engineered well to suit pilots.
Maintenance of the jet fighter wasn't much different from most other World War II combat aircraft. German field conditions near the end of the war were anything but ideal, but the Me-262 was just as rugged as many of the Luftwaffe piston-engined aircraft. However, foreign matter was frequently sucked into the intakes and posed a constant hazard to the Swallow's jet engines, making intake covers mandatory for every plane. A conventional nose-wheel tow bar was used whenever the aircraft was moved around the field. This was made extra secure by cables attached to the main gear struts. The cables spread the towing loads and reduced the stress on the fragile nose gear strut assembly. Towing the plane was a job left to the Kettenkrad track cycle. This small gasoline-powered half-track combined plenty of torque with excellent maneuverability and was ideally suited to the task. The Kettenkrad could operate over a wide variety of terrain and in all kinds of weather. As the Luftwaffe's most valuable asset, the Me-262 was often afforded the luxury of covered and camouflage revetments, which, because of the constant threat of Allied air attack, soon became a necessity. The elite men chosen to fly the Swallow found it an extraordinary experience. Gunter Rahl, the Luftwaffe's third highest scoring ace with 275 kills, explains.
I took the chance to get a checkout on the 262. And this was very sensational to me, you know, running up very slowly on the runway, the engines very slowly, because you have to watch the temperature. If you accelerated your throttle too rapidly, you go to over temperature and you get fire on your engine. Could easily happen. So this was to be careful, you know, as a fighter pilot, have a throttle in a propeller engine, you just very rugged, forced back. You didn't care for that. In the 262, you have to observe this.
With his instructor standing on the left wing, an Me-262 student pilot begins his taxi. Virtually all of those chosen were experienced combat flyers, so instruction centered on the quirks of the tricycle landing gear and the temperamental nature of the jet engines. The Swallow's throttle was tricky and had to be handled with exceptional care, especially during engine starts. Starting the engines was an involved process. First, the small Riedel two-cycle starter motor kicked in, and the main turbine spooled up. Once 800 to 1,000 RPM was reached, the electrical ignition system was turned on. At 2,000 RPM, the starter engine was disengaged, and at 3,000, the throttle was moved to the idle position. When running, the main engines were rated at nearly 2,000 pounds of thrust each, with a turbine speed of 8,700 RPM. Me-262 trainer jets weren't available till late in the war, so the pilot's first jet flights were always solo, a daunting prospect for even the most seasoned flyer. Instructors remained in radio contact throughout the course of the flight. The effortless performance of the aircraft never ceased to amaze Luftwaffe pilots. Speeds exceeding 500 miles an hour were stunning to men who'd never flown so fast, even during maximum performance dives. On the other hand, the slow throttle response of these early jet engines caused problems, especially during takeoffs and landings. Whereas propeller-driven aircraft reacted instantly to throttle movement, jets demanded that the pilot think well ahead.
Once you get airborne, it was a very heavy aircraft, taken up speed. And until that time, it was not too maneuverable. So therefore, we protected the takeoff and landing periods by the old-fashioned fighters, 190 or 109, over the field, over the airfield. Another sensation was a very, very good radio, receiving transmission. There was no interruption in the engine, you know, all this. And it was very quiet, very loud and clear for that time. As you had in a normal, in a propeller fighter, you always had in your telecom, you had your very strong background noise. I didn't recognize this is a 262, and it was very, very comfortable.
To a fighter pilot, speed is intoxicating, and at 500 miles an hour, it was rare to find a flyer unimpressed by the Me-262. At the time, the world's piston engine speed record stood at 469 miles an hour. The Swallow broke that mark nearly every time it flew. Here, at last, was the aircraft with which the Luftwaffe could reverse the fortunes of war. Vastly outnumbered, and with its cities in ruin, Germany hoped that with this new technology, it could win back the skies and save the Reich from destruction. D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, signaled the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. Forced onto the defensive, Hitler was no longer the hunter but the prey. The Führer was obsessed with the 262's potential as an offensive bomber. This obsession with revenge and attack would move Germany one step closer to final defeat. Within weeks of the Normandy landings, other advanced instruments of terror were thrown against the Allies. The most infamous weapon of vengeance was the V-1 flying bomb. Unpredictable and deadly, it heralded the beginning of a new kind of warfare. The V-1 proved difficult to counter and savagely effective. Equally impressive was Messerschmitt's revolutionary interceptor, the tailless Me-163 Comet. The rocket-propelled Comet was capable of near-sonic speeds and boasted climb rates spectacular even by today's standards. Famed Comet pilot Rudy Opitz reflects on Hitler's insistence on the manner of the 262's use.
And since normal propeller-driven aircraft couldn't fly in because the British had a fighter force that was in the air and could intercept anything. Not from the ground, they had it in the air. And though bombers couldn't really fly in, it was much too expensive. But the jets seemingly could. And so he wanted the 262 to be a bomber, to fly again to attack. And so the time was lost to try to make a bomber out of what had been a very effective fighter.
Renowned Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland was an ardent supporter of the Me-262 as a fighter. He once said that flying it was, quote, as though an angel were pushing. Galland was convinced the 262 was a generation ahead of any fighter in the sky. He argued with Goering that production should concentrate on the Focke-Wulf 190 and the 262 only. No other aircraft, he claimed, were as essential to the defense of Germany. Hitler fanatically insisted the 262 be used offensively as a lightning bomber rather than the defensive fighter so desperately needed. But the Führer's lack of vision wasn't the only impediment. The experimental nature of the aircraft itself had already slowed the process. Ceaseless pounding by Allied bombers and victories by Allied ground forces had all but sealed the Reich fate. The heavy destruction wrought by round-the-clock bombing had taken its toll. Irrespective of Hitler's blind insistence on transforming the 262, the plane probably couldn't have entered service any sooner than it did, by which time any opportunity to turn the tide of the air war had long passed. German industry was stretched to the limit, and the average German lived in a netherworld of charred rubble and sleepless nights. Germany was in ruins. Millions were dead. Only young boys and old men remained to wage war. By late 1944, defeat was inevitable. Most hoped simply to survive until the bombs stopped. In the middle of this madness, Me-262 production found itself beset by yet another problem. Competition had arisen in the form of the Arado AR-234, a short-range attack bomber and reconnaissance aircraft. The 234 was a composite of some of the most advanced technology in the world. Powered by the same UMO-004 engines, the 234 was a major drain and soon bled dry the already anemic jet engine supply. Some efforts were made to free up the supply of UMO engines by adapting 4 BMW jets for the Arado. Ironically, this reconnaissance plane was much more suited to Hitler's idea of a blitz bomber. The 262's logistical problems turned into a nightmare. Hitler's insistence on forcing a fighter to be a bomber only compounded the problem. To Luftwaffe ace Günter Rall, the proper role of the 262 was vividly clear.
You know, Hitler always was thinking in offensive measures. And the best example is the 262, you know. He wanted to make a 262 to a bomber without any electronic, and you know, he dropped the bomb, they never saw where the impact was, you know. It was stupid. But he was thinking in offensive measures, and Galland said, no, we have to produce fighters, fighters, fighters. But they come pretty soon. But he was right. At the end, he got across with Göring, you know, Göring blamed him and the fighters because the biggest success of the 8th Bomber Fleet on the British at night. Then he resigned and he took over the Wing 44. Hitler asked him, what are you doing? He said, I want to get the Wing 44 and prove that the 262 is a fighter, which he did.
By April of 1944, the first planes were sent into service at Lechfeld. The following October, this unit, by then called Kommando Nowotny, was equipped with some 30 of the new jet fighters. Shortly after entering combat, the Swallow drew blood for the first time. In June 1944, 2 Lockheed Lightnings and a de Havilland Mosquito fell victim to 262 guns. Another Mosquito survived, however, returning to England with photographic evidence of the new fighter's existence. Though it lagged behind, Britain's new Gloucester Meteor had a layout similar to the 262, but was much less sophisticated. Powered at various times by a variety of Rolls-Royce jet engines, it saw limited action during the last year of the war and was only marginally effective. In July 1944, Meteors embarked on their first sorties against V-1 flying bombs, recording their first V-1 kill on July the 27th. Incessant Allied bombing raids pounded Germany. By late 1944, Hitler finally conceded that air defense was imperative. Stories of a German superjet tore through Allied ranks. The 262 slashed through bomber formations at unheard-of speeds and was superior to every single enemy fighter. It was even faster than the gun turrets on Allied bombers. When flown by a competent pilot, it was simply untouchable. But Germany's fate had already been sealed. It
was a plain fact that we're going to lose the war. No doubt. Whether you get better aircraft, better fighters, or better protection, it's a matter of time. But the specific air situation would have considerably changed if the 262 would have been produced in masses. It would have changed the American bomber situation, no doubt.
But it was too little too late. The Me-262 could not stem the tide of war. Allied forces advanced relentlessly. Germany's factories, its cities, and its people were beaten. In a final act of defiance, Luftwaffe pilots, embittered and out of fuel, torched their own planes to leave nothing for the victors. By the spring of 1945, Germany's military might had been crushed, and the Allies were pushing deep into the heart of the Third Reich. Allied fighters and bombers could fly virtually unchallenged in the skies above the fatherland. Little remained of Germany's ability to make war or even defend itself. Every day, the bombs rained down. The devastation was total. Germany's once great industrial heartland was reduced to rubble. It could no longer fire the furnace of war. Hundreds of thousands, old and young, military and civilian, lost their lives. The Third Reich literally caved in on them. By war's end, over 7 million Germans were dead. As Allied forces advanced deeper, they discovered exciting new technologies hidden throughout Germany. Technology retrieval teams, like Watson's Wizards, scoured the countryside in a trusty old C-47, earmarking anything of significance. General Watson recalls.
We could land it almost anywhere, and we had to do that. In a lot of cases, we landed in cornfields and sleep under the wing and have breakfast under the wing and take off the next day to go somewhere else to find something.
German aircraft were of particular interest to Operation Lusty, as it was codenamed. Teams had the job of getting captured aircraft out. Watson sent Bob Strobel to deal with the Me-262.
He said, go down to Leckfield, take charge of the group down there, train the pilots to fly the Me-262, train the crew chiefs to maintain it, and ferry him out to Cherbourg. And he left me with my mouth wide open as I was trying to get to ask him, hey, hey, what do I know about? And he's gone, So that was my first introduction to Lusty. I found about anywhere from 25 to 30 jet fighters on the field, around the perimeter of the field, and revetments and in various conditions.
U.S. teams worked fast, encroaching Soviet forces adding to the urgency. Germans helped to get the remaining 262s airborne.
We worked with these people and didn't find any animosities amongst them. They were apparently pretty proud of the airplane that they had. They wanted us to like it, and they seemed to be agreeable to working with us towards the end that we were going for, trying to get those airplanes out of there.
Great Britain was also quick to exploit the technology. Captain Eric Brown flight tested the 262.
Many aspects of their engine technology and their armament technology showed they were very advanced. And in fact, after we actually captured a lot of these aircraft, we were rather horrified to find how far ahead they were.
Among the extraordinary weapons discovered was the Ruhrstahl X-4 air-to-air missile. It was slated for use on the 262 and had been extensively tested from a Heinkel HE-111. Even more lethal 262s were discovered, including one equipped with a huge 50mm cannon. The barrel projected 7 feet in front of the plane and was so heavy that a counterweight had to be added to the tail. The V-9 was built for high-speed research and set an Me-262 speed record. It was modified with a special low-drag canopy. The Me-262 V-186, called the Heimatschützer, or Homeland Defender, had a rocket engine in its tail. Used in concert with the jet engines, it helped shorten takeoff and improve climb. The two-seat Me-262 trainer was meant to lower the high accident rate. It was considered an important find for U.S. intelligence. Test pilot Jack Willems stands next to a Heinkel HE-162. The Volksjäger, or People's Fighter, was a last-ditch attempt by the Luftwaffe to get another jet into the sky. Because it was produced in relatively large numbers, more Me-262s were recovered by the Allies than any other German jet. Bob Strobel ferried many of them back to Cherbourg in France and became very familiar with the aircraft's unique qualities.
Was really impressed with the enormous speed, the effortless speed, the quietness of the engine, and the vibration-free. I was astounded at these 400 and 500 mile speeds that we're making without doing any great, just tapping the throttle a little bit.
Cherbourg on the French coast was the gathering point for recovered Luftwaffe aircraft and a busy place at the end of the war. After the delivery flights, the planes were loaded aboard the British ship HMS Reaper for the long journey to the US. All aircraft were cocooned to protect them from the salt air. While Allied pilots were ferrying the 262, it became apparent just how impressive the aircraft was.
General Spots, when he saw me fly the Me-262, commented to me afterwards, well, his major expression was wicked. Now, he wasn't the guy that would talk a hell of a lot about these, but his one expression is wicked. Then he told me, gosh, if they'd used that airplane correctly, we wouldn't have stood a chance with our B-17s. We'd have lost a whole bunch of them.
Flying enemy aircraft across war-torn Europe had many hazards. Mistaken identity, unfamiliar cockpits, and hidden problems like the fragility of the nose gear could cause many accidents.
Of all of the fighter airplanes I've flown, that was I would say, for that period, the most exciting and the most combat-worthy, and you could do anything in it.
And Watson wasn't alone. Nearly all the pilots who flew it extolled the virtues of the world's first operational jet fighter.
When they get in the air, when everything is working, the Me-262 was probably, without any doubt, in fact, the most formidable aircraft of World War II.
Surviving Me-262s are few, and well-preserved examples are rarer yet. One of the most interesting belongs to the Planes of Fame Museum near Chino, California. Historically significant because at one time it was owned by billionaire pilot Howard Hughes, this 262 had a taste of revisited glory in the film Jet Pilot. The same aircraft, shortly after the war, was entered by Hughes in the Bendix Trophy Air Race, where it would have competed against operational U.S. fighters. Hughes' offer was turned down, however, because some feared the vintage German jet would outrun its competition. Among the racers Hughes' Me-262 was expected to face was the transonic North American F-86 Saberjet, perhaps the most advanced combat aircraft of its day. The F-86 had acquired much of its wing technology from 1942 designs for a fully swept-wing Me-262. Although this advanced configuration was never constructed, the original Messerschmitt plans were put into practice by North American. converting what would have been a mediocre aircraft into a truly great transonic jet. Born into tragedy, Messerschmitt's Me-262 was the crowning achievement of the Luftwaffe. Meant to aid Nazi aggression, instead it ushered in an entirely new era, the jet age. General George S. Patton said that wars may be fought with weapons, but they are won by men. Those sentiments were probably of little comfort to the first Allied flyers to face Messerschmitt's Me-163 Comet. With a top speed of 620 miles an hour, the Comet lived up to its name and was the fastest aircraft of the Second World War. Now, 40 years later, the guns are silent and the world is a very different place. But at the RAF's Aerospace Museum in Cosford, this piece of history lives on. For although the regime the Comet defended has long since perished, the technology it pioneered is now an integral part of modern life. The marriage of rocket power and a startling swept-wing design foretold the shape of things to come. Called the powered egg by the elite men chosen to fly it, the 163 is still the only rocket-powered fighter to go into combat. Air power was really born during the First World War. Early on, field commanders sent aircraft aloft to get a better idea of what the enemy was up to. Soon after, fighters were developed to intercept these craft and bring them down. After the armistice, the Treaty of Versailles imposed severe restrictions on Germany's Air Force, restrictions which in many ways brought them one step closer to the Comet's technology. Alternative forms of propulsion, like rocket power, had not been mentioned in the treaty. At the time, rocketry just wasn't taken seriously. It was more of a slapstick promotional gimmick, used to grab the attention of the anything-goes public of the Roaring Twenties. In Europe and America, rockets were attached to just about everything imaginable. If you wanted people's attention, a rocket would make a big splash every time. In Germany, automobile tycoon Fritz von Opel sponsored the world's first successful rocket car in April 1928. The converted Opel Racer was powered by Sander black powder rockets. Under the direction of rocket theorist Maximilian Ballier and driven by Kurt Volkart, the car reached 70 miles an hour. It was soon followed by the more streamlined Opel Rack 2, fitted with 24 Sander solid-fuel rockets. In Berlin during May 1928, with Opel at the wheel, it reached its maximum speed of nearly 125 miles an hour. It needed inverse wings to hold it to the ground. There was little control of speed and limited endurance. But the huge cloud left behind created just the spectacle Opel wanted for the cameras. The Sander black powder rockets were developed from maritime life-saving rockets. Safe and controlled ignition was a rarity, however. Opel's team tried countering directional problems by building a rail-mounted car. The volatile rocket tubes were fairly primitive and housed together at the back of the vehicle. The car itself had to withstand extreme temperatures and was often scarred by their uneven and uncontrolled burning. The stunts were sheer spectacle and followed eagerly by the public. The scientific community, however, didn't share this enthusiasm. It seemed what was important was the publicity itself. The bigger the explosion, or more breathtaking the crash, the better the result. Opel's rocket consultant Maximilian Valier pursued experiments of his own. Through his writings on rocket spaceflight, Valier enjoyed a popular following, but many of his exploits ended in disaster. The rocket was proving hard to tame. A stigma followed the rocket. The public saw it only as a silly advertising gimmick. Solid fuel rockets and their uncontrollability left many believing that rocketry and folly were one and the same. Reinhard Tilling's airmail delivery system was one among many postal rocket concepts. His device, full of mail, was blasted to a great height by solid fuel rockets. When it reached its zenith, wings would spring out and the rocket would float spiraling back to Earth. In Germany, with a little help from the newly empowered National Socialists, Gerhard Sucher demonstrated his large airmail rocket cylinder, which was stuffed with letters and postcards. The charred remnants inside never made it anywhere, and neither did the postal rocket concept. In Nazi Germany, a race of warriors was being bred, and young children were encouraged to learn aviation skills in government-backed model glider competitions. The boys became young men, and the gliders got bigger. Almost imperceptibly, a new generation of airmen embarked on its training. Finally, in 1935, Hitler presented the Luftwaffe to the world, audaciously renouncing the Treaty of Versailles. Now, new pilots and new technologies would rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. Along with the pilots that found their wings gliding, came a new generation of aircraft designers. Here, high in the Rhön Mountains, was the Wasserkuppe, a resort established specifically for gliding. Before the First World War and long before Hitler's rise to power, this was the home of serious gliding in Germany. In the 1920s, the sport swept the country. Gliders of all shapes took to the air here, high in central Germany. And of all the designers who came, Alexander Lippisch was one of the most innovative and respected. Pioneering both the low-drag tailless glider and the aerodynamic flying wing glider, his were some of the most exciting planes soaring into the skies. They would soon become of great interest to others than just avid followers of the sport. But in 1928, Fritz von Opel's passion switched from rocket cars to rocket flight. He'd encountered a problem never posed by his rocket cars. The tail surfaces of a conventional aircraft lay directly in the path of the rocket thrust. This little aircraft was designed with its tail set high. It was actually Opel's second rocket glider. Months before, he'd sought out a brilliant glider designer he'd heard about who was working on a tailless aircraft high in the Rhön Mountains.
And so he came up there to our mountain resort and asked about this, whether we would have a plane which had no tail on it. He wanted to try a new engine. And I said, well, we have this Canard type, which has an elevator in front and nothing at the rear, and we could use it for this. And so he came up in summertime with these rockets, and we mounted the rockets on this thing, 3 rockets. And Mr. Stamer, Fritz Stamer, who was at this time the instructor of our gliding school, he made the first flights with this rocket plane, but then we thought that the reliability of the rockets wouldn't be too good at this time. I don't know whether it's too much better now.
Lippisch's Enter became the first rocket-powered aircraft. Opel turned to a more conventional configuration for this, his next flight, but brought together Lippisch's tailless aircraft and the rocket in a connection that would have a profound effect on aviation history. Meanwhile, by 1930, Max Valier began work on liquid-fueled rocket cars. Liquid fuels made rocketry much more feasible, with more control and greater endurance, but it was still dangerous. In May 1930, while observing a liquid fuel rocket motor in action, Valier was hit in the heart by a fragment when the motor exploded. He bled to death. The use of liquid propellants had many advantages, and solid fuel systems fell by the wayside. The Walter Company created a system that ran on hydrogen peroxide. The Luftwaffe took great interest in this to assist bombers during takeoff. These rocket-assisted takeoff pods, or RATO units, would be used throughout the war. The work paid off when an experimental rocket-assisted Heinkel 112, originally meant to use liquid oxygen-based fuel, adopted Walter's motor instead. As confidence increased in the Walter motor, many felt that this auxiliary power unit had the potential to propel an aircraft entirely on its own. Churchill called World War II the Wizard War because for the first time such emphasis was placed on science.
The essential part of the war today is a guy who has big glasses and a huge slide rule or computer, figures out how you have to shoot this missile or what it is.
In 1938, the clouds of war were gathering, and the Luftwaffe launched a new endeavor, the construction of a rocket-powered fighter. For this, the Walter rocket motor was chosen. The Walter motor had been refined and was now using improved fuel consisting of 2 ingredients. With the rocket engine well under development, Luftwaffe planners had to find an airframe for their new weapon. They turned to Lippisch. This is one of the test models built by Dr. Alexander Lippisch. A light, tailless fighter aircraft. Its radical nature did little to inspire enthusiasm.
Many other people thought that we should build normal defenses, propeller-driven planes, and then Messerschmitt himself wasn't very much enthused about all this project. Even
so, the concept was taken on by Messerschmitt, and the Luftwaffe sanctioned work on the first tailless rocket fighter. The model was known as the ME-163A. Project X had top security cover. These screens were to hide the Model A from prying eyes. The very first Comet is wheeled into the hangar where Lippisch and his team worked for so many long months to prepare the little aircraft. Still, the maiden flight was postponed several times because the Walter rocket motor wasn't yet ready. Finally, in 1940, the famous German glider pilot Heini Dittmar, who'd flown many hours in Lippisch tailless aircraft, was ready to take the first Comet into the air. The problem with rocket motors at the time was their limited endurance. On the one hand, there was tremendous thrust and an incredibly high rate of climb. On the other, it burned up all its fuel within minutes, relying solely upon gliding ability to get back down safely. Even with the small engine employed, the 163's maiden powered flights completely vindicated Lippisch's aerodynamic theories. The sweeping wing, blending into the fuselage, handled superbly. As these trials proceeded, larger engines were already under development. They were to be powered by more advanced fuels. Confidence ran high. But there were fears. All of the valuable flight experience on this dangerous project was being invested in a single pilot, Dittmar. Given the Luftwaffe's increased enthusiasm for the Me-163 and the fact that there had been several near accidents, it's perhaps not surprising that demands were made that an additional pilot be found. Rudi Opitz, another glider champion, well respected by Lippisch, became the second man to fly the revolutionary machine. He found it a whole new experience.
If you had a dish of bean soup or something like that, you were in trouble because at that high climb rate, you blew up like a balloon. We sent all our pilots to Germany's highest mountain. There was a hotel up there, and we would have them there for I think 3 weeks to get adjusted to the altitude.
Its high rate of climb was unique, but in many ways it handled like other planes of the day, and was truly a pleasure to fly. The mainstay of Lippisch's basic concept, and perhaps a legacy of his glider designing days, was that the Comet should be as light as possible. To this end, the aircraft was never fitted with its own undercarriage, but rather relied on a dolly that was jettisoned just after takeoff, and the landing was executed on a retractable skid. The takeoff procedure was very risky because the dolly was known to bounce back and strike the bottom of the aircraft, possibly puncturing the tanks full of volatile fuel. It's very evident just why the 163 consumed so much fuel in such a short time.
They wanted to fly it over a measured course. They had set up a course along the Baltic Sea with theodolites to see how fast it flies, because up to now the first 3 flights were all climbing flights.
During the speed test, the Comet was towed to its release height, saving fuel exclusively for the run. Dittmar is in the 163, Opitz in the tow plane. This particular model was fitted with a 750-kilogram thrust engine, nearly twice as powerful as those used previously. Incredibly, the plane exceeded the magic mark of 1,000 kilometers an hour. But in doing so, the Model A was pushed beyond its design capabilities.
It accelerated very fast to that critical Mach, and it just went out of control. And fortunately for Dittmar, when it went out of control, nose over, the negative G-forces shut off the fuel.
The fortunate accident gave Dittmar control. The 163 was now the fastest aircraft ever. The veil of secrecy left Dittmar's achievement untold. Heini Dittmar's luck didn't last, however. He soon became the Comet's first casualty.
The seat was sitting direct off the structure, of the very rigid structure for the skid that supports the skid. And there was no give. There was nothing that would buckle or so. You sit without a cushion on that seat. And when he came there, it was like a hammer. Here he was sitting in terrible pain. He couldn't move.
The landing skid wouldn't lower, and the impact left him with a broken back. For now, Heini Dittmar was out of the program. In October 1941, the decision was made to turn the experimental Me-163 Comet into a combat fighter. Germany had been at war for 2 years and sorely needed a defense for the fatherland against swarms of Allied bombers. It would be some time before Germany would suffer punishing attacks of concentrated daytime bombing, but even the current toll taken on industry was far too high. Smaller factories could be hidden or even moved, But larger complexes like blast furnaces, chemical works, aviation factories, and ball bearing plants, vital to the Reich war effort, were vulnerable and utterly exposed. Plans were made to station the Comet around high-risk targets, briefed to defend vigorously the plant or factory under its guard against flotillas of enemy bombers. By the middle of 1943, American daytime raids with up to 1,000 bombers and as many as 700 escorts were punishing German industry daily. There was clearly no time to waste in getting the Comet into action. The fighter version of the 163, the B model, was designed for simpler mass production and could carry more fuel than the Model A prototype. An ME-163B was flown at the end of the war by British Royal Navy test pilot Captain Eric Brown. We reacquainted him with the Imperial War Museum's Comet in Duxford, England.
Getting into the cockpit of this remarkable aircraft again after many, many years brings back a lot of memories. And I remember very, very well my first impression of ever seeing it. I was struck by how small it was and yet how elegant it looked, and at the same time how very lethal. Lethal not only to the enemy but to those who flew it. Inside the cockpit you had on either side of you, just beside your legs, the two tanks holding the T-Stoff fuel. So you were really encased in a cockpit, very small cockpit, with these two dangerous fuel tanks on either side of you. And indeed, once you were in flight, you were virtually in a metal coffin. When you lowered the skid and got the indication that it was down, you then had to return the lever to neutral. If you failed to do this, the skid would be under compression, and therefore you would have a solid landing bed with no cushioning at all. And this is what caused many, many pilots to break their backs in this aircraft. One of the amusing things is when we put it on show at the end of the war, many people came up and said, "Good heavens, is this the propeller that drives this airplane?" But in fact, this is just a small propeller which drives a generator inside the nose of the aircraft to supply the electric power. As you lifted off, you jettisoned the trolley at about 15 feet off the ground. And this height was quite critical, because if it wasn't correct, if you dropped it too high, you might get a very heavy bounce, and the trolley could come up and hook itself onto the front of the skid. The other danger was it could actually come up and puncture the fuel tanks, which were located in this area, each side of the pilot and in the wing. The wings, of course, are swept back, as you see, and this was a novel feature for us at this time. The sweep back here is not very acute, it's 23 degrees. But it was, of course, the thing that unlocked the way to supersonic flight. We have a fixed slot in the wing, which was, of course, to improve the stall and the maneuver, low-speed maneuver conditions. As you go along, you'll see we have a skid under the wingtip. Now, as the aircraft landed, it would slow down to, and at about 40 miles an hour, it would be too slow for the pilot to be able to hold the wings up on aileron. So eventually, one wing or the other was going to drop onto the ground, and this was to take the weight of the contact. But in spite of this, the aircraft never slewed to either side. It ran absolutely dead straight, even with the wing on the ground. There is no tail unit other than the vertical tail unit, of course, fin and the rudder, but there are no elevators or tail plane as such. And we have here elevons. In other words, the elevator and the aileron control are incorporated together and work differentially. Allied fighters had a rate of climb of the order of 3,000 to 3,500 feet a minute. This thing, when it got going, actually had a rate of climb of the order of 14,000 feet a minute. And so you were talking about a startling quantum jump in the matter of climb performance. I've flown in my time 5 tailless aircraft, and the other 4 were all killers, frankly. This is the only one that had good flight characteristics. And I think because of this, it started a lot of enthusiasm for the tailless design. But nobody quite ever got it right, like Alexander Lippisch managed to get it right on the 163.
Neither the Americans nor the British ever produced a tailless plane equal to the Comet. The first combat 163s were ready for their tryout flights by February of 1944, and by the end of the year almost 230 were delivered. Getting them into action was another story, because every aspect of the plane and its operation was new to ground crews and pilots alike. It was a daunting endeavor. The pilots even had to wear special overalls to protect them from the fuel. The Comet was anything but conventional, and men flying the plane had to be intimate with its peculiarities. Even bailing out of the aircraft was by no means easy.
And the canopy would float 1 inch over the frame and wouldn't blow off. It flew in the boundary layer of the aircraft. And it went through all maneuvers, and he came down and hadn't gotten rid of the canopy. And when it came to a stop, the canopy fell off. And we took a broomstick long to try to push up the nose section of the canopy to make it, get it out of the slipstream and make it break off.
Although it wasn't yet in combat operation, the Luftwaffe had a precise plan for their swift little plane. And in protecting vital installations sure to be targeted by the Allies, their role would be crucial. Still terribly limited in range, the Comets had a flight radius of a mere 25 miles and a maximum 10 minutes flight time. In fact, fully 1/3 of their fuel supply was consumed simply in getting off the ground. The remainder was burnt as the aircraft rose at over 80 yards a second. When it reached its operational height, the Comet had less than 2.5 minutes to intercept enemy planes. It was a handicap, yet the plane's great speed also meant that within 5 minutes of scrambling, 163s were diving through Allied bomber formations. After a few swift passes, the attack was over. With no fuel, the Comet would simply glide back to base. This unpowered descent was a time of great vulnerability, with no second chance at landing and no power to avoid enemy fighters. Experienced pilots could come in steep and fast to avoid any lurking fighters, but the inexperienced would have to fly a long, slow approach. This was the window of opportunity for Allied aircraft to pick the Comet off. Mobile recovery units, known as shoe schleppers, were always on hand to remove the landed Comet quickly. Without them, the aircraft, completely immobile, was a sitting duck for prowling Allied fighters. The shoe schleppers' arms lifted the Comet onto a small centerline track and hauled it away safely. And while the relentless American bombing attacks went on, swift recovery meant that a Comet could fly several missions a day, sometimes within the span of an hour or so. Back at base, the ground crew would jack up the aircraft and the detachable dolly was fitted under the skid. These robust dollies were tailored for each individual aircraft and had to be thoroughly inspected before being used again. But the next step was the most dangerous. A single mistake in refueling the 163 would cost lives, so the strictest procedures were followed. Of nearly 300 Me-163Bs built, more were lost in fuel explosions than by hostile fire. First, the fuel tanks and any plumbing where the traces of fuel might still remain were completely flushed out. In fact, the tanks always held a small amount of unused fuel. The flushing process was absolutely vital, because by now the Comet had an advanced engine which used two types of fuel, C-Stoff and T-Stoff. Extremely volatile, these chemicals demanded great caution. When the tanks were fully topped off with water, compressed air was shot into the fuel system to ensure that every crevice was washed. Only then was the water released. The next job required even more caution. Refueling the 163 was taken one step at a time. The two fuels, T-Stoff and C-Stoff, were difficult to tell apart, so everything was very clearly labeled. First, the C-Stoff, a hydrazine hydrate and methanol fuel mixture, was carefully pumped into its separate tank. During the entire process, plenty of water was kept running to neutralize any spillage. The fuels were so volatile that many Comets simply exploded on the runway. When the C-Stoff was loaded, the ground crew washed off anything that might have come into contact with the toxic fuel. Only when the C-Stoff tanker was well clear of the aircraft did the truck containing T-Stoff approach. T-Stoff was basically hydrogen peroxide, and as a precaution was handled by entirely different service personnel. The reason for these strict procedures was quite simple. If even the smallest amounts of the two chemicals came into contact, the results could be disastrous.
I would say the handling of the fuel was not too difficult.
How powerful was this fuel? I mean, supposing some got on your hand.
Yeah, well, then you burn. If you stick your finger in it, then you get only the bone out.
It was that...
Oh, yeah, this is like a very high concentrated acid. Yeah.
The fuel was so corrosive that pilots had to wear special flying suits impregnated with neoprene, and even this provided only limited protection. T-Stoff was the really dangerous element. If it came into contact with organic material, it would ignite. As Opitz found out, his 163 slid into a ditch on landing, and leftover fuel leaked into the cockpit. Some of it penetrated his gloves and made contact with his hands. It was his skin that did the igniting.
I was in flames. My hand was burning, and this is because the gloves, it had soaked through the fabric, and when it touched the skin, it burst into flames. And the fabric, just nylon, if it gets hot, it cakes. 'cakes. 'You couldn't get it off.
'The fuel was so corrosive that pilots had to wear special flying suits impregnated with neoprene, and even this provided only limited protection. So the tea stuff, which was basically hydrogen peroxide, was obviously handled with great caution. The hose nozzle was encased in a sheath to avoid any spillage, and again, liberal quantities of running water were at hand to neutralize any excess. But accidents still occurred. The wings were in danger from any spillage of tea stuff, as they were constructed from wood. Many Luftwaffe aircraft had major wooden components, as metals were always in short supply. If the concentrated hydrogen peroxide came into contact with organic wood, the reaction would be disastrous. Because the two propellants looked the same, one simple mistake was pouring one into a container which held a small amount of the other. Again, disaster would follow. The volatile nature of these fuels must have preyed heavily on the minds of those who worked with the comet. After refueling, the 163 could be anchored down for a static engine run. When the hydrogen peroxide and the hydrazine hydrate reacted in the combustion chamber, between 660 and 3,300 pounds of thrust was produced. Full throttle, the tanks had only enough fuel for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. During these static tests with no cooling airflow, water was sprayed on the rocket orifice. The Volta HWK R2-211 rocket motor was simple, as the whole rear section of the fuselage could be removed. The combustion chamber was at the end of a 5-foot pipe that extended back to the propellant turbo pumps. The little motor was ingeniously cooled by sea stuff circulating between the chamber's inner and outer walls. This was crucial, otherwise the hot gases inside could burn through the motor wall. This strange and awkward piece of rocket plumbing could push Lippish's pure aerodynamic shape to unheard of speed and climb rates. One of the greatest setbacks the 163 program encountered was a freak accident involving Germany's famous woman pilot, Hanna Reitsch, whose aviation exploits had made her a national heroine. In October 1942, Reitsch used her prestige to get a flight in the 163. But the dolly didn't detach properly and she was injured when she made a forced emergency landing in a nearby field. It was a potentially fatal blow to the program.
I proved that nothing is wrong. I attached a dolly to it, fixed that it couldn't come up. I flew it, and I landed it, and this was necessary to get the program going, because she was such a very highly regarded person that something happened to her that is not worth the program, and it could kill the program.
The Comet program survived Hanna Reitsch's accident. But in spite of Lippish's continued success, his relationship with Messerschmitt deteriorated, and he soon moved on to other things.
Messerschmitt he knew quite well from old glider times, because Messerschmitt himself started out early with gliders, very old Wasserkuppe time, when Lippisch was new there and Messerschmitt built up there. So there was some contact there before, and Messerschmitt agreed to have him in to do that. But of course, I don't think it would have ever been a relationship that could prevail over any length of time.
Lippisch moved to Austria, but never lost his fascination with flight. His fertile mind continued to delve into the many realms of aviation. Most of his time was spent in developing a radical design for a delta-wing ramjet. By the middle of 1945, American daytime bombing was tearing the heart out of German industry. The cry went up to waste no more time before getting the Comet into action.
They considered our training flights a waste because they felt every time there were all those aircraft flying in and bombing the country to pieces, and here they were sitting on the ground and using the very precious fuel for training flights because it was war, and they felt they are ready to go after a couple flights.
As the bombing escalated, the vital installations necessary to German survival were strained to the limit. Deprived of them, the Reich would be broken. The time for the Comet's debut had finally and urgently arrived.
Since we could climb with the military version of the plane in 2 minutes to about 33,000 and stay up there and make probably 2 or 3 passes, a large number of these planes would certainly made it very difficult to attack at daytime with bomber units.
In their tight box formations, American 4-engine bombers were easy prey.
Our factories and our supplies and all our railroad lines and all this would have stayed intact. Well, that means that you have more possibility to survive. I knew for myself, I knew it in 41, that the war basically was lost.
You think it would have been irretrievably lost even with your plane?
Yeah, I think we could only survive.
With the daily toll taken by Allied bombing becoming fatally high, the Luftwaffe selected large potential targets difficult to relocate, such as steelworks and oil refineries, for protection by 163 squadrons. By July 1944, they were fully operational. Situated close to their assigned installations, 163s were kept in constant readiness, sometimes with their pilots even waiting in the cockpit for the call to arms. By the end of 1944, over 230 Comets had been produced, and many of these were already on active duty. The problem the Luftwaffe's conventional interceptors faced in combating American bomber formations was accurately predicting where and when they were going to strike. And even when they guessed correctly, it could take half an hour to get there, by which time the damage was done. The Comet had no such problem. Like a spider in its web, it just sat, waiting for the drone of the B-17s. On the go signal, everything happened very quickly. Within 3 minutes, they could be at over 30,000 feet, with several minutes of fuel left to use in attacking the bombers. Comet's great speed and small size made it an impossible target for American gunners. By the same token, their speed worked against them, because 163 pilots actually had difficulty training their own cannon on the aircraft they stalked.
The 30mm gun fired so slow that if you were out of phase, a B-17 could fly between the bullets, just like you shoot a machine gun through the propeller.
Once this lightning attack was finished, Comet pilots faced the most dangerous part of the mission, the gliding descent back to base. Without power, they had only one chance to land safely. And in the process of getting down, they were defenseless against prowling Allied fighters.
The bomber formation came in with fighter escorts. And though there was no safe level anymore, now when you came down to the airport and you set up a pattern and you go back to pattern speed, say at 5,000 feet, you come over the field and you slow the aircraft down and try to land, you are an easy prey for fighter pilots who just wait outside the airport and wait till you come back.
But their effect on the fortunes of war, like all the German wonder weapons, was too little and too late. By then, the Third Reich was far too enveloped by defeat's embrace for anything to save it. The comet never came close to altering the course of the war, but in many other ways, Lippisch's brilliant design did have a tremendous effect on the course of aviation history and modern life itself. The X-planes of the post-war period, a vital link in man's quest into space, were utterly reliant on rocket power. And like the comet, they too glided back to Earth following burnout. The supersonic airliner, the Concorde, can trace its lineage directly back to Lippisch's work with the delta wing configuration. He's recognized as the father of the delta wing. An even greater parallel with the 163's flight profile is the space shuttle. This tailless delta-wing craft uses phenomenal rocket power to soar beyond the atmosphere itself before gliding back to Earth. After the war, Lippisch went to America, where his genius was well recognized. In 1965, he founded the Lippisch Research Corporation. The man and his work were inseparable. Even in quiet moments with his family, his passion for flight burned deep inside him, only extinguished in 1976 by his death.